Can I welcome everyone to this, the 17th meeting of the Public Petitions Committee in 2020. This meeting is being held virtually. The only item on our agenda today is the consideration of a continued petition, Petition 1517, polypropylene mesh medical devices lodged by Elaine Holmes and Olive McElroy on behalf of Scottish Mesh Survivors Hear Our Voice campaign. And we're joined today by Neil Finlay MSP and Jackson Carlaw MSP, both of whom had long-standing interest in and commitment to addressing the issues highlighted in this petition. The petition is calling the Scottish Government to suspend use of polypropylene transvaginal mesh procedures, initiate a public inquiry and/or comprehensive independent research to evaluate the safety of mesh devices using all evidence available, including that from across the world, introduce mandatory reporting of all adverse incidents by health professionals, set up a Scottish transvaginal mesh implant register with a view to linking this up with national and international registers, introduce fully informed consent with uniformity throughout Scotland's health boards, and write to the MHRA and ask that they reclassify TVM devices to heightened alert status to reflect ongoing concerns worldwide. Following its last consideration of the petition on 3rd September, the committee was very grateful to receive a written submission from Dr. Veronicas. Dr. Veronicas is Director of Female Pelvic Medicine and Reconstructive Surgery at the Centre for Vaginal Surgery and Urogynecology in St. Louis, Missouri. Following his written submission, the committee agreed to invite Dr. Veronicas to give oral evidence. We're therefore absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Veronicas to our virtual meeting today, and we are very conscious of the pressure on his time, appreciate the time he's given to us, and hope that we can make as productive a use of his time as possible. We recognise a whole world out there for Dr. Veronicas, which is way beyond the world of our committee. So can I invite Dr. Veronicas to provide an opening statement before we move to questions? Thank you.
Madam Chair, thank you for inviting me to speak to the Scottish Petitions Committee today. It is an honor and a privilege, and I appreciate the 10 minutes for my statement. I am a surgeon. I'm not a politician. I'm in unfamiliar territory this afternoon. Many communications have arisen out of my interactions with Scotland. I cannot possibly reference all of them today. However, I believe my account to be fair and accurate. Mesh-injured women contemplating undergoing mesh removal surgery do not do so lightly. Surgeries on women following partial mesh removals can be the most difficult gynecologic operations. Mesh-injured women are in pain, in distress, and they need transparent medical care. I have successfully removed thousands of mesh implants, slings, prolapse mesh, rectopexy mesh, sacrocolpopexy mesh. For over 20 years, I've been the surgeon of last resort for women who seek other choices or options, and for women who have had partial removals of mesh from other surgeons and are still in pain. Annually, I perform over 600 surgeries per year. I would like to talk about the Scotland offer. When Mr. O'Kelly was appointed in June 2019 by the Scottish Government, I worked under the assumption that the urgency of the mesh-injured women's situation was foremost in everyone's mind. The goal of the project was to provide surgical help for the mesh-injured women. The training of local surgeons is a byproduct of helping these women. On paper, it appeared that everything was in place to make a success of this project. I was assured that Scotland's medical community wished to work together with me to make this project happen. Team Scotland was backed by the First Minister, the Cabinet Secretary of Health, the Chief Medical Officer, the assigned lead mesh removal surgeons, and all the influence of these officers and power. Yet, here we are today. No members of this team have been able to complete the regulatory process. No document has ever been issued that could be considered a letter of intent or an employment contract. In early November 2019, when in St. Louis, the former CMO promised me that the regulatory process would be completed within a month of her return to St. Louis. She stated the sponsors had to be OBGYN specialists. Although the CMO is an OBGYN and could endorse my application, she stated it would be better if it came from the lead clinician, Mrs. Karen Guerrero. CMO Calderwood assured me that she would provide the necessary sponsorships, letters, and employment contract. In return, and on this condition that the regulatory process be completed, I agreed in principle to a visit to Scotland in spring of 2020 to primarily review patient files. schedule surgery, and start the project of caring for these women from there. There is correspondence with the detail of possible itineraries as discussed. But there was never any agreement that I would visit Scotland before the GMC regulatory process was completed. There was no misunderstanding about that. Only when the crucial step was completed would I finally be able to make what I hope to be the first of multiple extended journeys to Scotland to care and operate on the mesh injured women. Upon returning to Scotland from St. Louis, CMO Calderwood shifted the goalposts. I was asked by CMO Calderwood to fly to Scotland in spring of 2020 to attend an educational event. CMO Calderwood's request came one day after I'd been contacted by Mr. Chris Harding, the MESH spokesman for the British Association of Urologic Surgeons. He had indicated that he had pitched this idea to the CMO Calderwood. CMO Calderwood contacted me the next day and stated it was her idea. When I questioned the CMO why she was adding this element to the itinerary, her response was sponsorship. I should engage with the attendees and ask for their support to sponsor my GMC application. In short, Team Scotland medical members would not be endorsing the GMC application. I clearly communicated to the CMO that under no circumstance would I fly to Scotland without the completion of the GMC application. The more I communicated this position, the more CMO Calderwood glossed over the problem. She continued to send letters with plans for the visit in spring 2020. I read in the press that the Scottish parliamentary records about the visit of spring 2020 visit by myself. It was based on barren ground. I was bitterly disappointed for the mesh injured women, not only of Scotland. So what were the problems? There were several indications that there was a great willingness to delay any real progress in this project. The phase one was June 2019 to September 2019. In June 2019, when the project started with Mr. O'Kelly, who was appointed by the Cabinet Secretary, I knew I would be in Europe for the ICS meeting in September. Mr. O'Kelly had initially extended an invitation to visit Scotland while I was in Europe. However, things changed. Mr. O'Kelly then stipulated that the Scottish team must visit me at Mercy, St. Louis. I did with good grace accept and accommodate a visit to St. Louis in July. It was organized. The Scottish team canceled. The grounds given was that Mrs. Guerrero was not sure of her commitment to the project, and she had also childcare issues during the summer. I then received an urgent request from Mr. O'Kelly to organize a visit in August 2019. I arranged the visit once again, and days before, the Scottish team canceled due to schedule clashes. When the Scottish team canceled in August, I reminded Mr. O'Kelly that I would be in Gothenburg at the ICS conference from September 3rd to September 6th, and then in the United Kingdom. Mr. O'Kelly suggested that he may visit me and another surgeon in Gothenburg. No further invitation for me to visit Scotland was extended, and since then I've had no further communication from Mr. O'Kelly. Two issues of note. I was not aware of any members of Scotland being at the ICS meeting in Gothenburg. During the ICS meeting, a prominent U.S. colleague approached me and stated that the Scotland clinicians at the ICS meeting needed his help for mesh removal, and he had informed them that I was the best person to help them. The U.S. colleague sent emails introducing me to the Scotland team and attempted to arrange visits for the Scottish team to meet me in St. Louis. In any case, had the Scottish team visited me in St. Louis in July or indeed in August, I could have visited Scotland in September when I was already in the UK and started the process, even staying longer in Scotland if needed. It made perfect sense to me that the surgeons were not on board with this project despite all the reassurances I'd been given. At this juncture, I withdrew my project. In October 2019, I agreed to return to the project following a brief conversation with the First Minister of Scotland. This was under the direction of CMO Calderwood. The Scottish team eventually visited me in early November. I hosted CMO Calderwood, the two lead mesh clinicians, a member of the nursing staff, and a member of the physical therapy team. They arrived at my office on Thursday at 11 a.m., November 7th, 2019, and departed at 11 a.m. Friday, November 8th, 2019. I remain of the opinion that the trip of the Scottish team to St. Louis for 24 hours was not an essential part of the project. When CMO Calderwood left St. Louis, it was clear to me that CMO Calderwood would ensure that the regulatory process was completed, as she stated, within a month. When the CMO returned to Scotland, she did a U-turn on that agreement. She made the unreasonable request that spring 2020 visit would be used as an opportunity for me to canvass and acquire sponsorship from attendees of the educational event, a symposium. Confounding this was that Mr. Harding notified me that he was in discussions with CMO Calderwood regarding the symposium. Again, I do not know what CMO Calderwood communicated to the Cabinet Secretary, to the First Minister, and to her successor, Interim CMO Gregory Smith or Mr. Harding. I know the sequence of events that were promised. First, the GMC process to be completed, and any suggestion to the MESH injured women that I was arriving in spring of 2020 was not transparent. First, at no point did I agree to CMO Calderwood's suggestion of a symposium, and in no uncertain terms, I made it clear I would not canvass anyone, ever, for sponsorship. Secondly, even if CMO Calderwood had delivered her promise, the purpose of the visit in spring 2020 had not been to commence any care of surgical treatment for the MESH injured women. I could have been in Scotland in September 2019. In conclusion, my involvement in this project is flavored by delay and what appeared to be a war of attrition. Whatever the motivations, the outcome demonstrated to me that there was no sense of urgency in delivering the project to help the MESH injured women. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for that indeed. I think that's a very helpful statement, but I also think it's one that the committee will view with some concern in terms of just all of the delays. And for me, even the suggestion that you have to come to some event to look for support is astonishing. Can I just ask one brief question before I move to my colleagues? The petitioners have repeatedly urged the Scottish Government to engage with you as they have great faith in your skill and the treatment that you have been giving to MESH injured women. And indeed, one of the issues has been that women did not feel they were being believed by the profession when they were commenting on the pain that they were suffering. But can you just explain for the record what you're doing at your clinic that is so different to what other surgeons are doing at present?
I listen to the patients. I ask them, when did the pain start? How did the pain start? Where's the pain located? The trajectory of these slings follows a very specific path with small variations depending on the type of sling and the woman's pelvis. And the pain is not only in the middle, it's on the left, it's on the right, it's in multiple areas. So removing only a piece is not helpful at all. It actually makes it much more difficult to help these women at a later time.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I call Gail Ross, please?
Thank you, convener. Good afternoon, good morning, Dr. Veronicas. Thank you so much for joining us. You say in your written submission, and you explain there in your opening statement, you offered to come here with the intention of helping these women. Can you maybe explain what that work would have involved? Would it have involved initially operating on some patients and then passing that over to surgeons that you've trained, or was there an agreed amount? Did you ever get that far to any agreements on what exactly you would do over here?
No, never really did. As a surgeon, I kind of take for granted some of the things about caring for women. It always starts with a history and physical to understand what the woman's complaints are, to then discuss with her what is reasonable, what is available, to have a transparent discussion with her on how this can be treated. And then my understanding was that the women that were suffering from MESH injured surgeries would undergo surgery under me. I would be doing the surgery. I was okay to have surgeons observe, but I've spent my lifetime mastering and refining and continuing to polish tens of thousands of hours in the operating room to develop techniques and instruments, which I'm very happy to share. But it is not something that can be learned in a day, a week. It's not see one, do one. A transobturator sling can be a TVTO, can be a Monarch, can be an Auris, can be an Optrix Halo, can be an Align curved, can be an Optrix curved, and they have variations. The implantation of these meshes behave differently post-implantation. They have different colors. They curl differently. There's so many things that need to be learned. The learning curve is very steep. So I had suggested with Mr. O'Kelly an initial trip I would come, I would schedule some surgeries, find the appropriate operating room time, and then I would be traveling back and forth. And during that time, I would train whoever had the requisite skills to be able to continue.
So one of the things that the Scottish Government has offered the survivors at the moment is, I suppose, extended involvement with the surgeons that initially implanted the mesh. And so can you understand then the survivors' reluctance, I suppose is the word, to continue any kind of medical treatment or even dialogue with these surgeons, because I think that there's a huge breakdown in trust there.
Trust is very fragile, isn't it? What I know of the literature and what I know of my own practice is that women don't return back to the surgeon that operated on them, whether it's a complication from a hysterectomy or whether it's a complication from a mesh product. When women perceive that they're not being listened to or they're not getting the choices that they want, and women have choice, they move on to the next surgeon. And as they move on, they acquire more knowledge, do more research, and become more aware of what's available for them. Generally, the meshes I remove, not implanted by myself, other surgeons. And it should be a woman's choice to seek out whomever she wishes to be her surgeon or her doctor.
So in that sense then, with such a small pool of surgeons to call on in Scotland, really the survivors have got no other choice than to get someone like yourself in that hasn't dealt with them before.
That's true.
Thank you. That was my last question for that one, convener. Thank you.
Thank you. David Torrance.
Thank you, convener, and good morning, Dr. Veronicas. Thank you for giving up your time to give evidence to committee today. The petitioners have explained that the most used mesh devices in Scotland is a TVTO device. We believe that when removing these devices, surgeons in Scotland are mostly removing them vaginally. In your opinion, can the mesh devices be successfully and safely removed vaginally?
No. The mesh.
Short and brief answer.
Yes. Well, it's really that simple. The trajectory of a transobturator sling, whether it be a TVTO, is that it goes under the urethra. It then perforates the sidewall muscles called the obturator muscles, which are lateral rotators of the hip, which is why these women have hip pain, because the mesh adheres to the bone and limits the normal function of these muscles. It then passes through the entire adductor musculature. So to remove that portion under the urethra in the vagina does nothing. And honestly, if they did a tiny little partial, it's better than if someone did a bigger partial, which removed the mesh all the way out to the muscles. Because the problem is that this mesh adheres to the bone and then limits the function of normal musculature. There is no way on this God's green earth that an entire transobturator sling can ever be removed only through the vagina. It requires an incision in the skin lateral to the vulva to identify the end of the mesh in the musculature. And there's two techniques. One technique is cutting the muscles, taking them off the pubic bone, and trying to reattach them. As surgeons, we know muscles are hard to sew. So the technique that I innovated is one that does not cut the muscles. So once you find the mesh, which can be very tasking, you trace it down very specifically, take it off the bone on the groin side, on the muscle side, and then on the vaginal side, and remove it. Depending on the variation of the woman's pelvis, it can be very difficult to find the mesh in the groin, which is why partials are so bad. Because if the sling is intact, you can get guidance as a surgeon to trace it from the vaginal side to the bone and identify the trajectory and remove it. So although it is that simple as no, the explanation is I hope it was brief enough yet detailed enough to explain the complexities of this implant and why no one should be putting in any implants that they cannot absolutely manage the complications and provide comprehensive treatment to any patient, whether it be a woman or a man undergoing any surgery.
Thank you for your answer, Dr. Veronicas.
Thank you. Gail Ross?
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I've got a couple of follow-ups on the explanation there that we just got. Excuse me. Dr. Veronicas, do you think that TVTO devices are useful at all? And if so, in what circumstances should they be used? And do you think they're being overused here?
I don't think they're useful. They were innovated in 2003 simply because surgeons were having a hard time doing a retropubic sling. Retropubic slings were the original slings made out of fascia initially described by von Giordano in 1907. And then through the years, the technology evolved. But retropubic slings emulate more normal anatomy. Transobturator slings were innovated for those that had difficulty doing retropubic slings. They do not follow a normal anatomic trajectory. They do not emulate any normal anatomy. Women have variations in their pelvis. They have variations in the vaginal sulcus. Under the urethra, the sulcus dips up, and the mesh follows a straight line, so it creates a band effect. There's been a scientific paper that said up to 80% of transobturator slings can have a band that is palpated on clinical examination. The conclusion of the study was that they don't know the significance. Other paper by Chohan cited that 25% of women undergoing a transobturator sling have de novo pain with intimacy. I don't know any woman that would change a little bit of leaking or a lot of leaking for having a 25% chance of pain with intimacy. So in my opinion, there was no place for transobturator slings. And then if you fast forward how many years later, 17 years, now you have an implant in a woman that can't be removed easily or safely without drastic consequences such as cutting the muscles, which may never be able to be reattached successfully.
So really, the TVTO device was created for easiness for surgeons rather than benefits to patients.
I think that point could be argued by those that do them, but my opinion is yes, there was good success with retropubic slings. The complexities of doing a retropubic sling mandated another technique. In my opinion, the surgeons that were not able to do a retropubic sling perhaps should have referred those patients to someone that had higher volumes. The literature clearly states that high volume surgeons get better outcomes. I think my mother, my aunt, deserves the benefit of a high volume surgeon that does this all the time.
Okay. And in terms of either full or partial removal, can you tell us how you would approach surgery on a patient that had partial removal already?
So the first thing I do is I look at the implant op report. I try to acquire an implant log, which tells me what implant I'm looking for, because many times everything's called the TVT. For some reason, TVTs become generic. It's like saying I drive a car. So there's different cars, there's different implants. So it's very specific. Then if they've had a partial, I try to get the operative report. And sometimes the op notes are very replete. If there's a photograph, I try to get a photograph. If there's a pathology report, I try to get a pathology report. We published a poster stating that the median length of a TOT sling is approximately 22 centimeters. So the sling is 44 centimeters. When it's implanted, it's cut at the edges, so about 22 centimeters. So I base it about 22 centimeters. Depending on how much was removed, if I can document it, it gives me an idea where I will look for the mesh. If it's 2 centimeters, it should be 2 centimeters that was removed. It should be to the left and right of the urethra. The problem comes when it's 3, 4, 5, and women have different pelvises. A smaller woman with a narrow pelvis, that mesh is going to be further out in the obturator muscles. And there's where the problem arises. That mesh retracts back. It's glossed over with scar tissue, which means that I then need to make selective cuts into this woman's obturator musculature through the vagina to try to look for a fiber or palpate scar tissue, which means in certain cases, depending where it was placed and what the woman's pelvis is like, it is much more traumatic to find the end of a cut piece of mesh than if it was intact where I could trace it. I might spend up to 30, 40 minutes trying to find the end of a severed piece of mesh. So I believe that eventually anyone that's got a TOT sling that's having problems, that the medical community will eventually agree that for transobturator slings specifically, that entire mesh should be removed at one surgery.
Is there ever any situations where partial removal would be the preferred course of treatment? And if it is, what happens with the mesh that then remains inside the body long term?
In my opinion, no. And let me explain why. If a woman has a sling, whatever that sling is, and the only symptom that exists is incomplete empty, which happens with false slings, even an autologous sling made from her own body. There's a little retention, they're not emptying their bladder, they're getting bladder infections, they're having urgency. A division of the sling is indicated, okay? But if you have an exposure, a little snip, what one must understand is that when that's the tip of the iceberg. These implants are in the vaginal wall, to be exposed in the vaginal wall. The best example is if you are walking on a lake in the wintertime. The edge of the lake is frozen, but as you get to the middle, the ice gets thin. So where the exposure of the mesh is, it gets very thin. If you trim part of it, it may come back. And the tissue on top of the sling cannot be pulled together with sutures. What happens then, the exposure is bigger. If you remove any amount of the sling, even if you divide it, it may not work as well. So if you remove a centimeter of the sling and the woman has incontinence, now to go back and fix her, your second operation is going to run into this implant. The best chance for cure, and it's documented in the literature, is with the first sling. So if a woman has a sling, how do you bring her back to the first sling? By removing and clearing that tissue, letting it heal, and almost starting over. And I've tried all these things. I spent my days doing what I like to do most, which is care for women in the operating room. That's what I'm good at. I've tried, when women ask, can you do it all in one surgery? The outcomes are not the same. And there is literature to support that a second sling doesn't work as well at one setting. I do have very good success if I remove the implant, I allow the tissue to heal. And ironically, and we presented a poster on this, when you do a complete removal, half the women don't leak. I think it's because of the scarring that ensues. Half the women don't leak.
Okay, thanks. Last question on this one, convener. Dr. Veronicas, can you give us an overview of how much of your work is now mesh removal rather than mesh insertion?
So over half my practice is managing complications of mesh implantation. Okay, I am a gynecologic surgeon. I predominantly do vaginal surgery. I take care of prolapse, fistulas, recurrent prolapse, urinary incontinence, fecal incontinence. I only offer retropubic slings. I offer women 3 types of retropubic slings. From their own body, a biologic sling, and for the sake of completion and transparency, I do mention polypropylene slings. Women only choose polypropylene sling when it's the only option that they want.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you very much for that. I'm very struck by just the challenge that this medical process has meant for women, and your description of what the consequences of that are very powerful. Can I take you back just very briefly to the way in which you've been treated by the Scottish Government? Because obviously the scandal around mesh has unfolded over a period of time in Scotland, and a lot of people perceived you as being someone who was going to be able to help address these concerns and find a way forward. You already outlined quite a troubling communication between yourself and the Scottish Government, but I wonder, do you think at any point the communication was a serious one, or do you think that in general terms there were barriers being constructed to you coming in and helping us in Scotland?
It seemed serious in the beginning when, Mr. O'Kelly tried to schedule a visit, and it became pretty apparent that it just was not going to progress. One thing I never want to take away from my patients is hope, and I never want to give false hope. And I've maintained during this entire time that I do not want the same for the women of Scotland. So the reason I moved away from the project is I felt that the women were getting false hope. They were hoping that some sort of resolution for them would be soon, and it just didn't seem like it was happening. And then there was an opportunity. I was in Europe, so I don't know if they were ever really serious past Mr. O'Kelly.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I ask, just very briefly following that, were there ever any other alternatives discussed? I mean, there was a suggestion you would come, but it looks as if that wasn't really a serious proposal. But was it ever suggested that there could be video conferencing that would be used to allow you to observe and advise surgeons in theatre? Was anything like that looked at?
No.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Can I move to Tom Mason?
Thank you, Convener. Dr. Veronicas, welcome. Really, to go forward to clarify what's been going on. In your submission, you stated that you required sponsorship from Scotland as part of the General Medical Council Eminent Visiting Surgeon Scheme. What does the scheme require?
My understanding is a sponsor. I have been a visiting surgeon to the United Kingdom in 1998. It was actually a very easy process. I operated in London. Perhaps things have changed, but my understanding is it requires a sponsor and a contract from the NHS. None of those things are truly under my control.
Okay. So, further on from that, our understanding is that such programs and knowledge exchanges occur regularly. How many exchange visits have you participated in other countries or other areas within the USA?
So in prior to 2000, I had visited Spain, I had visited Italy, and the United Kingdom. Approximately around 2000, I have dedicated my time to polishing and mastering and teaching surgery. I was the program director for the OBGYN residency program, which required my time to be here. So since then, I have not gone anywhere else.
And have you had many surgeons come to St. Louis to learn from you?
Yes.
How many approximately?
Easily 50.
Okay. So very used to such process.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Maurice Corrie?
Thank you, Gavina. Good morning, Dr. Veronicas. Thank you very much indeed for coming and appearing before us today. In your submissions, you state that you have withdrawn your offer in frustration at the lack of action by the Scottish Government. Have the Scottish ministers or officials ever explicitly said no to your offer, or is it the lack of progress being implicit in rejection of your offer?
Yes, the latter.
Right, okay. Can I also say, have you ever experienced, in fact, do you feel there's been any resistance from the Scottish medical fraternity to your proposal and indeed involvement in Scotland?
I believe so. I had a conversation early on with Mr. O'Kelly where all the clinicians were on the phone, and then in subsequent discussions with Mr. O'Kelly, he stated that one of the clinicians was not on board. She wasn't sure of the consequences or really involvement, etc. So it was an unselfish offer to help women. That's all it really was. No one needed to be threatened. I would have cared for the women, trained the doctors that were able to be trained. I did tell Mr. O'Kelly that not everyone can be and should be a mesh removal surgeon. Mesh removal requires surgeons with the finest technique, the most experience, who are able to grasp new techniques and methods of surgery.
So basically, you feel there was that resistance?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Can I call Tom Mason, and then I'm going to call David Torrance back in briefly after him?
Thank you, Convener. We understand that the former Chief Medical Officer came to visit you with the clinical team and to observe you and your colleagues in practice. In your written submission, you state that following this visit, you were hopeful that a proposed project would materialise. Did the Chief Medical Officer give you any indication that there was a problem achieving this objective?
No. Actually, she said that, she could make the application happen within a month.
Further, though, then in your submission, the Chief Medical Officer suggested that you should attend a symposium in Scotland to work for the crowd for a sponsor. Can you explain what that symposium was, what you were invited to do? And given that what occurred after her visit, do you think that the visit from the medical officer and the clinical team was a genuine attempt to move the situation on, or effectively a gesture to placate the mesh trainers?
I'm not sure I understood the latter part of that question. Would you be kind enough to repeat that question again?
Yes, it's the medical officer suggested that you should come to the symposium and in order to work the crowd for a sponsor. Given what actually occurred, do you think that this was a bit of a hype and the visit to you and your suggestions was not done in good faith and was actually being dishonest?
I would think so. I know that I can see where CMO Calderwood and I sat. It felt genuine. I was reassured. I was very trusting and hopeful. I agreed to come, and then the symposium concept I did not understand. If I was there, I would have been very happy to bring my hard drive, which I did when Scotland visited here, and show unedited videos and show thousands and thousands of mesh removal pictures and techniques to the clinicians I'd be working with. But the concept of me coming to give a symposium to ask people in the crowd, would you please kindly sponsor me? I'm sorry, I just cannot do that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. On that last point, would it be fair to say that any suggestion you should come and basically work a crowd was insulting?
Yes.
Or am I allowed to be insulted on your behalf?
Certainly.
Yeah. I mean, has any, in all of the work that you've done, has any other group of people come to you and said, we recognise your expertise, you want to come and see if we can get folk to fund your work in that kind of way?
No, I would not agree to that.
Right. Okay, yeah. Okay, thanks very much for that. Can I call David Torrance briefly, and then I'm going to go to Neil Finlay, followed by Jackson Carlow.
Thank you, Convener.
David?
Dr. Veronicas, Dr. Veronicas, you mentioned earlier that you had visited Italy and Spain to perform mesh removal. What steps did you have to take to meet doctor-surgeon regulatory requirements for those nations?
Would you repeat the question, please?
Right. You mentioned earlier that you visited Italy and Spain for mesh removal. What steps did you have to take to meet the doctor-surgeon regulatory requirements for these countries?
I didn't really do much. I submitted my curriculum vitae. I submitted my medical license, and the sponsoring institution did everything.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And now can I call Neil Findlay, who, as I said earlier, has had a long-standing interest in the issues highlighted in his petition. Neil?
Thanks very much, Convener. I wonder if Dr. Veronicas could compare and contrast the surgery that he does in relation to mesh removal with what he has observed from Scottish patients that have travelled to the US for mesh removal from him. So, looking at the surgery that they've had in Scotland prior to coming, what is the comparison between what you do, you have seen them being subjected to?
The women I've had the privilege of caring for from Scotland basically just had a partial removal under the urethra transvaginally. And what remained were the two ends of the mesh in the obturator and adductor muscles. All the women that I cared for were almost all identical to that, only the center portion. The center portion does not relieve what we call groin pain, which are the adductor and obturator muscles.
And my understanding is that you use a scanning technique to identify the mesh.
I'm sorry, what?
You use a scanning technique to identify, you scan the patient to identify the mesh so that you can trace it. Is that correct?
No, sir, that's not correct. I don't use any scanning techniques. It is based on surgical acumen and understanding of female pelvic anatomy and understanding these implants and knowing where they're at. I do not waste patient time and increase the costs with doing scanning that really provides nothing.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Having been involved in this all the way through and been extremely frustrated at what has happened over the piece, there are many issues that we can cover in terms of what happened, who was at fault, and all of that. But what is most important now is that we get the best treatment we can for women who have been mesh injured. Now, it is very obvious that, to me, that there was deliberate act by vested interests in Scotland to prevent you from coming. I am absolutely convinced of it. But we want the best treatment. So therefore, how do we get those women the very best treatment? Those women whose lives have been destroyed by mesh, but who have the hope that they can have a full mesh removal to remove this horrific product from their body. Can we do that by ensuring that the women are sent to you and the Scottish Government covers the cost of that? Is there no way back for you coming here? I know that you are committed to helping these women. So how do we do it now?
This has played my coming to Scotland, that offer to come to Scotland was so that women would not have to spend their life savings, to sell their homes, to borrow money, to do whatever they needed to do to get to me. Since June 2019, this has escalated in so many ways. I must tell you that I feel uncomfortable with everything that's happened. I don't know how I would be perceived. I know how I've been perceived. I don't know how I could possibly work within a medical team hospital where essentially almost the entire country of Scotland knows what has transpired. So I don't think that my coming to Scotland is can be on the table. Can the women come to me? Certainly. Many women do. I regret that not all the women can. As I stated earlier, I've dedicated my career, my life to doing surgery. It's what I do best right now. I operate 5 days a week, and I will continue doing that. I would be delighted to help the women, but at this juncture, they would have to find someone with my skill set or come to me.
And the alternative to that is that the government have said they are setting up a specialist centre that will refer women to it, and included in that would be mesh removal. Is it your view that from what you've seen from the women you have operated on, that treatment at that mesh centre will improve their condition or make it worse?
So I don't know what that mesh center involves. I assume it involves physical therapy. There's no data to suggest that physical therapy with a mesh implant is helpful. I mean, if you think about anything else in the body, if you have a piece of dust in your eye, you don't rub it. You leave it alone until it's out. Physical therapy afterwards might be beneficial, and I suggest that to my patients. But invariably, and you know, there's been women from Scotland that have operated on. You can see how they've done. They've had the partial. They're still in pain, and they're doing better. So I don't know what that mesh removal center involves. I don't know how they acquired their skill set. One thing I do to be transparent is I take pictures of every removal and I give it to the patient. It's something I learned. You know, they've been through such a journey with mesh. It provides closure for them. You know, it's something I learned when I was doing obstetrics. When a mom would lose a child, you put that child in her arms. It provided closure for her. And it's been such an arduous journey for these women that I take a picture and say, it's all out. These women are strong people. They can deal with the pain that they may have, whatever pain they have, and usually they all do better once they know it's out. So I don't know what the mesh removal center is involved. I don't know what skill set they have. I don't know what protocols they have. So I cannot not comment whether they would be better or not.
And final point, given the skill set, you question the skill set. Many of us have questioned the skill set also of the surgeons. It wouldn't be, if you were setting up a new service, would you be recruiting the people to it who had been part of the initial implantation process?
As I mentioned earlier, there are publications and literature that state that women don't want to go back. They move on. Rarely does any woman hold grudges against her doctor. She simply wants to move on and get different care by somebody else. One of the things that I asked Mr. O'Kelly when we were discussing was, I said, you know, I give pictures to be transparent. These surgeons that I'll be working with, can you send me a few pictures of what the removals look like if they're doing full removals? I never received that. So anyone that, you know, would have a very good skill set, was looking to improve it, I would want to see, what are you doing? How can I help train you to get better? Can you show me your last 10 mesh removals? I can look at that mesh and almost instantly tell you whether it's a partial or a complete removal, because I've removed thousands.
Sorry, one final point, convener. What's your view on the ethics of patients who have been advised that they have had a full mesh removal, only to go on to find out that they haven't and they've only had a partial mesh removal?
Well, that's where you lose trust, and there's may not be the proper transparency. It's not ethical. You know, patients do okay. If you tell a patient there is a piece of mesh on your major blood vessel, I could not remove it, and if I did, I would have this consequence. Invariably, the patient, the woman's going to say, "Thank you for not doing that." It's when knowingly you state that it's a full removal, knowingly you're taking a scissors and cutting it at 2 points, in your mind saying that it's a full removal from the vagina, but you're implying to the patient that it's a full removal, and in the patient's mind, she thinks her entire mesh is out. Well, that's not right.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Neil. Jackson Carlow.
Thank you, convener, and good afternoon, Dr. Veronicas. It's a pleasure to engage with you. Two of the women you've helped, in fact, are constituents of mine. One, Lorna Farrell, is just a few doors down that direction, and Elaine Holmes, who I know was one of our petitioners who was with you, is just about a mile behind over my back here. And I know that their lives have been transformed by the work you've done. So I want to publicly thank you for everything you've done for women in Scotland. What you outlined at the start of all of this, and what chimed, and I hope this isn't too convoluted a question, was essentially a professionally organised obstruction to your involvement here, to which it seems Catherine Calderwood became complicit at some point. And I recall right at the start of this process, when the Petitions Committee back in 2013 was considering these matters, Elaine Holmes and others being told by professionals here in Scotland that what they had was a psychological problem, that the pain they thought they were experiencing was something that was really in their mind. It wasn't a genuine physical expression of pain. And it seemed to me, therefore, throughout, that a lack of ability to deal with the issue was what was underpinning a reluctance on behalf of the profession in Scotland to allow you to participate. And I was struck by an expression you used slightly earlier in your evidence when you said, this is not a see one, do one type of operation. And I wonder, do you think it's possible that the profession thought that it was? that you might be able to come here and in 5 minutes, as you explained earlier, it couldn't be done. Is it possible the profession actually thought that's what could be done, and that the idea of your being involved in a more proactive, longer-term capacity was something that the professionals here in Scotland decided they didn't like because it questioned their ability to undertake operations in the short term, and so it suited them more to frustrate that process and to carry on with whatever alternatives they think they can perform?
I think so. The mesh centers were going up, so I would agree with that. You know, to put things into perspective, conservatively, a transobturator sling can be placed in 20, 30 minutes. It takes me over 2 hours to remove one, millimeter by millimeter by millimeter, without cutting the muscles. As I mentioned earlier, TVTO is very common. In some ways it's easier to remove, in some ways it's harder to remove. But clearly it's different from the Coloplast Auris sling, different from the Obtrix slings, different from the Align slings. It is not see one, do one. Learning curve for a transobturator removal is the hardest of all gynecologic operations. It is an area of the human body that we don't really study in medical school. I had to go back to cadavers and talk to multiple orthopedic surgeons as I was developing this technique. I have it refined because I've done hundreds upon hundreds, and they're still difficult for me. Last week, I spent 6 hours removing 2 TVTOs in a woman who was 38 years old that had one placed at age 31, a second one placed at age 38. It takes dedication, devotion, discipline. It takes time to know that you're not going to stop, that you're going to do the right thing. It is not C1, do one. It might be C50. C50, do one.
Right. I'm interested to know, I mean, I know from the women themselves that there are women who've been to see you, who've been told that they'd had a full mesh removal. It became perfectly apparent that they hadn't. Grimly, you know, it's almost described in centimetres what more has been found that has been possible to remove. I imagine too, this is a huge issue in Australia, not just in the countries that we've been discussing. I wonder whether women have been coming from places other than Scotland to you in the United States for this treatment to take place. But I'm struck, I mean, you've said that you think the future of the opportunity for you to come here, which many of us thought would happen, that your expertise would actually underpin the Centre for Excellence, which is going to be established in Scotland. And now, based on what excellence, I don't know. I'm tempted to beg you to reconsider that, but you seemed quite firm in your view there. So I want to know what now, since there are women here in pain who need to have hope, is on offer to them. I mean, it's for us as politicians to argue that the Scottish Government should fund women coming to you. Are there surgeons of a new generation here who could serve with you in the United States and become trained to bring that experience and excellence to Scotland in due course? What more can we, as politicians, and I recognise you're not one, so that's not your expertise, but what more as politicians can we be arguing happen here that will benefit these women as we go forward? Because there are too many of them still remaining who have seen what others have now been able to achieve and obviously hope that that's an option for them still.
Transparent standards of excellence. Transparent standards of excellence. Meaning detailed operative report. Every piece of mesh that's taken out is sent to pathology. Documented pictures on what was removed. There will be people on the planet that can do this, but that must be proven that can be done safely and effectively, and it requires commitment. No matter what you do, whether you play a sport or whether you're a politician or whether you're a surgeon or a mechanic, it requires commitment, devotion, and transparency on what can be done and what you can do, with the intent that you continue to strive to do the best you possibly can. And as I mentioned earlier, I think patients are understanding if someone did their absolute best, but I couldn't get a piece out of the tendon, I think any woman would understand that. Thank you for not cutting my tendon. You may have some pain there, you may not have some pain there, but I did not cut your tendon. I don't know how to train someone. You know, I have a partner that I trained. I have other residents that I teach vaginal surgery. They don't all remove mesh. It's an apprenticeship. Surgery is an apprenticeship. You need to work with someone that can quickly elevate your skill set and refine you, because that's what the patients need. They don't need someone learning slowly, getting complications. I've told my young partner, I said, a community pays a price for a surgeon. That surgeon practices on that community, and that surgeon will get some complications, but hopefully that surgeon will be able to learn from those and serve his or her community better over time. And that again, takes dedication. Not everyone can publish papers and give speeches. Someone needs to be in the operating room teaching surgery and performing surgery.
Okay. And finally, I mean, you've engaged obviously with the Health Secretary here and directly with the First Minister. The First Minister told Parliament most recently when she addressed this issue that she was prepared again to personally intervene. Is there anything further that she could say or do that would give you any further confidence?
I don't know how I would work in the system with everything at this point. When I first talked with Mr. O'Kelly, he said, well, in the United Kingdom, in Scotland, we work in teams. You're going to be put in this team, etc. With everything that's happened, I don't want to keep giving women false hope. I mean, we've been at this now almost 18 months. In the time I've spent engaging, I could have probably operated on 50 women.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. Gail Ross?
Yeah, thanks, convener. Obviously, really sobering evidence, and I'd just like to thank you again very much. Various members have asked questions of the Scottish Government in the Chamber. The two members that join us today that are not on the committee, Neil and Jackson, and also Alec Neil, who was due to join us today but unfortunately couldn't. And the Scottish Government are still saying that the offer is still open. What's your message to the Scottish Government, and what steps do you think that it needs to take now moving forward for these survivors? And also to the survivors that are watching, obviously it's a huge disappointment to them now after putting all their efforts into getting you over, and now hearing this evidence today would be quite devastating for them. So what's your message to them directly, Dr. Veronicas?
I've never had an offer from the Scottish Government. I made an offer to unselfishly come and operate. Give me an operating room 6 days a week, three to 4 cases a day, depending on the number of rooms. That was the offer. And I can't just show up in Scotland and say, here I am, I'm ready to do surgery. There's processes, regulations, licenses, GMC regulation. Scotland's never made an offer. I've never had a letter of intent. There's never been a contract. It was my offer to help so that these women would not use their life savings, as they tell me, sell their homes, borrow from their relatives. I think that's the first part to your question. What do I tell these women? I've never given you false hope. I've always tried to make sure that you understood and that I understood that there was hope, but I've never given you any false hope. I've always been transparent.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Tom Mason, briefly, and then we're going to move to summing up here.
Thank you, convener. Simple question. If arrangements were made for Scottish patients to come to you in US, how rapidly could you accommodate them? I mean, you said you could do 4 or 5 at a time in UK, but if they came to you, would that be the same rate or faster or slower, depending on, obviously depend on your schedule?
So I limit 3 mesh removals per day, especially when they're transobturator. Average time's 2.5 hours, but it can be longer. So I will do 3 surgeries per day. And I'm sorry, are you asking how soon could I do that?
Well, how soon and how fast? Yeah.
I'm scheduling surgery in December.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Can I ask one last question? I think you speak very powerfully to the women who have suffered, and I can understand why they have put so much faith in you, because I think your honesty is very powerful when you say that you're not giving them false hope. Is there a point where mesh injured women will not be able to be operated on? Is there a time scale beyond which women won't be able to be helped? I don't mean in practical terms about whether Scottish Government's going to change its mind, but actually clinically for women, is there a point where it's not going to be possible?
It's not a chronological limitation. It is if these women have partial after partial after partial, you reach a point where it may not be feasible to do anything anymore without creating even more scarring, more injury. If someone was to undertake one very good partial vaginally and one attempted partial in the groin, it leaves a section of mesh in the groin. Although I've been successful, I can see situations where multiple revisions of mesh prolapse implants make it impossible to do anymore.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think we've come to the end of our questions, and we really appreciate the time and seriousness with which you've responded to us. I wonder if you have any last comments that you want to leave with us. We'll be moving on to discuss what we want to do next with the petition. I'm conscious of your time that you may want to leave before the end of our meeting, but I just wondered if you've got any final comments before we move on to that.
No, thank you very much for the opportunity. I applaud your efforts, your sincerity. You know, it's one thing to stop the utilization of mesh. It's another to try to go back and help these women, which is very difficult. So I very much applaud your efforts.
Okay, in that case, can we thank you very much again for all your time and commitment. And I think probably I speak for the whole committee, regret that what has been a genuine offer has got itself caught up in, you know, bureaucracy, which is, it serves you ill and serves the women ill as well. As I've said, we appreciate very much your time, and if you want now to leave us, you can do. I appreciate you've got a very busy day ahead of you, and thank you very much for all that you have done for us today. I think it's provoked a lot of thought for us. We now really have to move on to think about any comments or suggestions for action. And I'm just going to go round the committee, and I will also take Neil and Jackson just to think about. We won't get a full agreement of what we might want to do next. The committee will come back to this, but I'm maybe going to call David Torrance first for any comments he might have about what we could do next.
Thank you, Convener. I'd just like to put on record that I thank Dr. Veronicas for all the evidence he's given today. I think there's been so much that I think we should take and digest evidence at another committee meeting.
Okay, thanks, David. Tom Mason?
Convener, I have a motto in my life: when all else fails, try honesty. And Dr. Veronicas has been very honest and open about his opinion, which has been much appreciated. Very refreshing, and I think the implications for what he says will, I hope, influence the situation as we come to various decisions, and we can get some progress made in helping these women who have been suffering greatly, and we do need to make some progress. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maurice Corey?
Thank you, Convener. I entirely endorse what David and Tom have said, and I was actually struck by the sheer honesty of Dr. Veronicas and delighted he's able to join us. It was quite shocking in some cases, the way he's been treated, but I do think that we need to discuss this more fully at another meeting, and I would recommend that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Neil Finlay?
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener. I think Dr. Veronicas is an extremely credible witness. I don't think he gave the impression that he was looking to deflect any questions. He took everything head on, and I think that was much to his credit. I think there are a number of things that we can do in this. If we take it in the order of priority, my priority is less to rake over old coals, but however, those questions still need to be asked and answered. The priority is what they're going to do for treating these women going forward. That is the absolute priority. Mm-hmm. And I think if I was asking the committee to do anything, it would be that we write to the government and say that we don't feel, and this, I don't know if the committee feels this, but I certainly don't, feel that the proposal to set up the regional mesh centre or the mesh removal service in Glasgow is a credible one for the women who have been injured, and particularly those who require a full mesh removal. Therefore, the Scottish Government should now be looking at agreeing to pay for women to go and have a mesh removal with Dr. Veronicas. If we look at the money that's been spent on the centre in Glasgow, it is a very considerable amount of money, which may be money that is being wasted, because if it's all set up and people don't use it, then we'll end up wasting money for a poorer result. So I think there should be, that is an option that the committee should be investigating. On the other stuff about how this happened, who did what, where and when, I think there are people who maybe need to come before the committee, and that would be potentially the former Chief Medical Officer, who I believe is still a senior member of the NHS in Scotland, and indeed some of the senior surgeons who were identified as being the ones who took part in the visit to Dr. Veronicas's hospital. I think they've got questions to answer.
Thanks, Neil. Jackson Carlow.
Couple of points, Convener. Firstly, when I actually look at the content of the petition, quite a lot of the evidence that we took from Dr. Veronicas today is additional to actually the focus of the petition itself. And looking at the petition itself, the initiation of a public inquiry, the mandatory reporting, the implant register, writing to the MHRA, I mean, I trust very much that the committee is pursuing those objectives. What I learned today was that the process of mesh removal is even more complicated than I'd understood it to be. And until now, I had actually thought that Dr. Veronicas practicing here in the UK would help to educate and inform a body of clinicians who might have been able to, in future, take forward that work here in Scotland. And I think that the see one, do one kind of line, and the fact that this really would require the association of dedicated clinicians over quite a long period of time before they had that expertise is something I think that really now needs to be considered, because I do think it is very much at the heart of what the options are that we have before us going forward for women who are suffering today. And I have to say it leads me more than I had hoped to the fact that the only option, really viable option for many of these women now, if they choose to have it, is to go to Dr. Veronicas in America. And I think that may therefore lead to Parliament having to really try and coalesce around the idea of the government having a formal fund made available to make that possible, because I think it's an invidious option to ask women to have to fund that themselves. I'd hope that might be only for the minority, but I'm kind of driven more to the view that if Dr. Veronicas isn't available to operate here, and I might still want the First Minister to have a further go at doing that, and for the committee to urge that upon her. But if that's not going to be an option, it doesn't seem that we're going to be able to train people here anytime soon to be able to do that full mesh removal. And I think we need to ask, Parliament needs to ask the government to fund that, and for that to become a sort of formal policy.
Thank you. Gail Ross, finally.
Thank you, Convener. I must say, I think that was, in the short time that I've been with the Public Petitions Committee, one of the most informative evidence sessions that I've taken part in, and I certainly learned a lot more about this subject. I agree that we definitely should investigate this further at a future meeting. I do take Jackson, and I'd like to thank Neil and Jackson as well for coming along and sweeping up with some very probing questions at the end. Yes, there is still a lot to do in terms of this petition. There are points on it that haven't been addressed. I also agree with the point that was made about essentially what's the point in setting up a centre with the surgeons that have performed this already if the women are not going to use it? And I think that is probably a bottom line in this thing. Really, really disappointing to hear that the very profession that let these women down in the first place is now letting them down all over again. And, you know, I think that's a national shame. So certainly taking on board all the suggestions that Neil and Jackson have made, having a look again at the petition. We had a chat last time about speaking to some more medical professionals, and I certainly wouldn't dismiss the opportunity to either get the Health Secretary and the former CMO in again. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Gail. I think there's a lot of important suggestions there. I think we all recognise, as how many times before, just how powerful it can be when we start exploring this issue, because I think Jackson and Neil in the past have talked about it as a medical scandal, and it just seems to be one that continues to compound the initial scandal, and I think that is a real worry. We need to think about the time when we will look at why does a minister come to Parliament and say that Dr Veronicas is still available when he's already said he's not coming, and he's not coming because of his treatment by the Scottish Government. I don't know about anybody else. I'm utterly offended and insulted on his behalf. The idea that somebody with that skill is asked to come and basically to go work a room to get some money. You know, this is not a crowdfunder for some wee issue that some hobby horse that somebody has, and I was deeply troubled by that. I do think that we're agreeing we're going to be at least one. We're holding on to the petition. We're going to discuss this again. I think there's work that the clerks can usefully do ahead of that being a very productive number of meetings. I think we should be writing to the Scottish Government. We should be asking them if they've done any cost-benefit analysis on setting up a mesh centre when it may be that the women have already said they won't use it. You know, what kind of, have they looked at that in a hard way, because they have to? There's not any point in ticking a box if women don't have the confidence to use that service. Have they looked at that at all? I certainly think we should be writing to the Cabinet Secretary ahead possibly of another oral session with the Cabinet Secretary, because there is clearly an audit trail to be done on what was said and what was done, but actually the question that was asked towards the end, that we asked of Dr Veronicas, what are we saying to these women? What are you now offering these women? The direct challenge that Jackson Carlaw has put, would you fund these women to go to have this treatment done in America? So I do think there's a case for an oral session, and I certainly think we should be looking to, we will get them anyway, but we should be looking at the reaction to this session from the petitioners, from the Cabinet Secretary and from the Chief Medical Officer, which is presumably will be able to answer on behalf of the past Chief Medical Officer. I don't know. So I think there's a range of things, and I'm assuming that people agree to those. I note that Neil wants to come back in, and I'll ask him to come back in just before we come to our final conclusions. Neil?
Thanks, Joanne. A couple of things. One of the other issues that the committee might want to try and clarify is, at the moment, I am assuming that the surgeons who have carried out so-called full mesh removals are continuing to offer that service. And there's big question marks over what exactly they are offering. So it may be that the committee could ask the question, is that service still being offered? And what is the skill set of the people who are offering that service? Secondly, and we also heard Dr Veronicas saying things like every time he does a removal, he photographs it, he sends it for pathology and all of that stuff. Does that happen here? As far as I'm aware, it doesn't. So there are technical questions around that as well. And the final point is, it may be worth asking the government what they're going to do about those cases of women who have been told that they have had a full mesh removal by surgeons practicing in Scotland, who then go on to find that they haven't. Now, I've asked that question of the government before, what they're going to do, because as far as I'm concerned, and Dr. Veronica's backed this up, this is extremely unethical.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much for that, Neil. I think in the first instance, we will be looking for responses to today's session from the petitioners, from anyone else who would want to respond. But explicitly, we're going to write to the Cabinet Secretary, and there's a series of questions that we want to ask that have already been outlined, including the ones that Neil has identified there. I think we will ask the clerks to look at who would we write to about these technical questions round, if you're saying it's a full removal, but in fact it's a partial one. Who's accountable for that? Where does that sit? And where's that skill set determined? It may be that that's Chief Medical Officer that responds to that, but we'll ask the clerks to do that rather than getting than making the wrong call right now on that. I noticed that Tom Mason's want to come in.
Yes, Convener, I think in the light of that, and I agree with entirely what you're saying, but I think we should try to get the questions in two halves. One, looking forward as to what can be done now and rapidly, and as opposed to mixing it up with the inquiry of what's gone wrong in the past, because otherwise people will be defensive, and that will not be very constructive for the way forward. So if we try and totally separate out the two for clarity purposes.
No, I agree that the committee's consideration will be that. I suspect it's very difficult for the women to separate it in that way, but I think you're absolutely right that we should be, there will be a point where we will be able to ask the Cabinet Secretary, why did you come to Parliament and say that this was still possible when Dr. Veronica had already said no, and has given very powerful reasons why he's now, desisted from being involved. And I don't think any of the responsibility for that attaches to him at all. So we can, but I agree with you that there are these two areas of work. What now for these women? What are the options? Is the Jackson Carlow option the only one that's available? And I think we can get through the clerks that we write to the Cabinet Secretary on those questions, but we also write to the Chief Medical Officer around the more technical stuff, and through them out to the profession round. I think Dr. Veronica was quite explicit. He did not regard it as ethical to say to women that you had, or create the impression that you had done a full removal when in fact it was partial. It was only full in a very narrow definition of it. So I think that we are now. One other thing that was mentioned in the run up to this was that Dr. Agar, who'd also given evidence before, and would be interested to hear from him in response to what you heard today, and that might guide some of the further action that we've taken as well. I think there's no doubt that there will be further evidence sessions, but we want to make sure that we've done enough of the groundwork round, get responses ahead of those. So I wonder if people are content, therefore, we're going to write to the Cabinet Secretary, we'll write to the Chief Medical Officer, and I will ask the clerks to provide some guidance on any other medical professional groups that we should be writing to around that. And I think, and I noticed Jackson has wanted to come back in. Jackson?
Yes, I was just going to ask, is it possible that the evidence session we've just had, will the clerks be able to ensure that's promoted actively on social media and the access to it is available? It's just when we're talking about Wael Agar there, I don't know whether he was watching or not, but I mean, if there was a link, I think actively promoted saying the committee's had this extraordinary session this afternoon and it's available for people to go and watch, I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah, well, I think you may be aware there was very active work done around promoting the session itself and that it was taking place, and there was a lot of interest in it. So I think that would be something we can ask the clerks to do to make sure that that there's an easy access to the session itself. I'm also very struck by the fact that in this day and age, actually having somebody like Dr. Veronicas accessible to us as a committee is much easier than it would even have been perceived to be 6 months ago. And I would want to thank the clerks, who I know did a bit of work to do to get the thing brought together, and the broadcasting team, and of course all of you who are willing to give up part of your recess. I know you're all working anyway, but actually, you know, committees don't usually meet during recess, but we're very much appreciative of that. So I think that Jackson is right. We want people to hear what was said. We're very conscious that the petitioners in particular will be looking to the considerations of the committee and what they've heard today, and I'm sure, again, it will be upsetting. I mean, I found it upsetting how much more upsetting it is for women who are directly affected by it. So we're very conscious of what has been done today. Unless I see anyone finally wants to come in, I will actually therefore recognise the significance, I think, of what we heard today. Repeat again our gratitude to Dr. Veronicas for taking his time at some ridiculously early point in the morning for him, when he is also, of course, going off to do his important medical work, and to thank you, the clerks and the broadcasters. There is clearly a lot more for us to do. We have a heavy responsibility, I think, as a committee, making sure that the seriousness with which this matter has been addressed thus far by those who are engaged with the committee, that we make sure that that's taken forward and give, as Dr. Veronica said, some hope to women who have been treated so badly in the past. And therefore, can I thank you very much for your attendance, and I'll close the meeting.